Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Marc Maron, comedian, actor, and host of the WTF podcast, has been doing some podcast appearances lately and kind of doing the circuit because he is ending the WTF podcast and I guess kind of moving on to the next phase of his career. WTF is like kind of a foundational podcast when it comes to the format of comedians kind of just talking into a mic and then ultimately interviewing people and doing very relevant and sometimes stirring interviews with politicians, other comedians, actors, and just like relevant people in culture. And so Marc Maron, though not the first to do this sort of podcasting format, he developed a style when it comes to the interviews that pretty much has become ubiquitous in culture, just in terms of a comedian who is inherently entertaining, being able to carry a conversation with virtually anyone and interviewing relevant figures, popular figures in culture, in order to become one of the most popular people in culture without necessarily doing stand-up. And, you know, Maron has been doing stand-up the whole time, but the success that he was looking for in his stand-up career came with the podcast. And I think that was the beginning of a new era of how the careers of entertainers work. And so, you know, he was on the forefront of that, and then over the years has become less relevant than figures like Joe Rogan, Theo Von, and other comedian podcasters who are now doing this sort of politician circuit. And though Maron has never done sit downs with like right-wing figures like Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, like some of these other comedians have, he did an interview with Barack Obama while he was the president, at the peak of WTF's sort of popularity and relevance. And, you know, arguably during that interview was guilty of the same thing. I mean, this was a sitting president, and it was a pretty softball interview, not aimed at really pressing him on tough issues, although I think he brought a couple things up that might have been sort of controversial at the time. You know, Obama skated through pretty much his whole presidency without any of the real controversies dogging him that much. So, you know, Marc Maron didn't necessarily like blow that open or anything, which he did in a way have the opportunity to do. But there also wasn't that much pressure on him at the time to do that. And also, I mean, I think it's fundamentally different to, you know, interview a guy like Donald Trump uncritically versus interviewing a guy like Obama uncritically. Although the president is the president, but still Donald Trump's actions, his words, they evoked such deep and troubling questions. You know what I mean? So much about Donald Trump is worth scrutinizing deeply. So if you're sitting across from him, it doesn't make sense to ask him softball questions. Although I would make the same argument about anyone who's the president virtually, including Obama. So Marc Maron is now kind of openly making his disapproval and his disdain and his disrespect for the current sort of right-leaning culture of comedy very known, very apparent. He's been doing that over the past few years, but I think in ending this podcast, doing a sort of promotion tour around that and around a special that he has just put out, you know, he is just trashing people openly, not necessarily in a way that's meant to grab attention, but in a way that doesn't care about grabbing attention. He knows that people are going to clip what he says and pay attention to what he says because he is name dropping specifically. I mean, he makes fun of Theo Von directly in his new special, and Majority Report did a segment about that. I won't play any of the special here, although I think you guys should go watch it because it is a very good special. His work is always very good. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's his main goal, is to promote his special right now, but I think he also feels and has thought about the dynamic of the sort of Rogan sphere comedians and his place in that, his contrast with that, but also the fact that he has participated in the same sort of culture and business. So, you know, none of that is lost on him. And, you know, the main flaw with Marc Maron is that as sharp as his observation and his critique can be. It's all very inwardly focused. It's all very self-focused. So there's usually not that much that you can do with the various observations that he puts out there. It's usually pretty Marc-centric, which maybe is one of the things that has also limited his reach over the years, is that even these conversations that he has with very interesting people, a decent amount of the airtime is focused on Marc Maron himself. So, that being said, I think that his specific position in the culture versus the Joe Rogans of the world specific position in the culture definitely gives him an interesting perspective on it all. So let's listen to a little bit of what he has to say about the current culture of comedy.
But yeah, me and who else?
Rogan.
Okay.
Who's that?
Joe Rogan.
Joey.
Joseph Rogan?
Yeah, he's out of Texas.
Oh, he Texas. Got it.
Yeah.
I got it. Got it.
Yeah. You love Austin, don't you?
He's running half the planet out of Texas.
Yeah.
He's got a tight hold on the enlightened meatheads.
Dude, Maron's disdain.
It's not disdain. It's reasonable criticism.
Reasonable criticism.
Yeah.
When was the last time you spoke with him?
I don't know. That's a good question. I guess it would have been at the store. I never talked to him in Austin. I don't go into the club. I don't really think I'm on his radar. So
something tells me you are.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, something.
Yeah,
me
something
too.
tells me
Me
you
too.
are.
I don't. It's weird that you get lumped into a certain thing, and maybe it's my assumption that his army of healthy fellas.
Is that their title? Army of Healthy Fellas is so good.
You just got to got to stay in, keep the machine.
The machine's got to be good.
Yeah.
That's a shot at Bert. Go ahead.
What do you think the Austin shelf life is going to be?
No,
Well, I don't know. I think that it's so effectively tribalized at this point. It really comes down to material. I mean, at what point? It's like whatever they represented in terms of policy.
Sure.
It's not a stretch. It's like they won. Trans people are frightened. They have no ability to get health care anymore, and they're afraid of being alive and have no freedom left. So that's done. When do you stop with the jokes?
When
And like immigrants, okay, well they're being ripped away from their homes, and they're all terrified, and okay, so that's done. When do you stop with the jokes?
Right.
I mean, it's one thing to pick on the vulnerable and the marginalized, but I mean, they're down.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
they're down.
why do you got to keep hitting them unless you're a hack? Now there's a question.
Wow. Mark.
he
Wow.
comes in swinging.
Yeah.
No, so I don't know the last time I talked to Joe. People for a while were like, why don't you go on Joe's show? And my answer to that is like, why? There's no way for me to, like, what am I going to talk to him about? And there's no way for me to sort of not walk out of there and be like, all right, I guess I'll look at my phone. Oh, fuck. How long is this going to go on for?
Right.
But it's like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X made me meeting at one point. Don't you think? Let's go historical with it.
the analogy doesn't work.
No.
doesn't.
He's so bad at analogies. Let him keep going with this. It's going to get funnier as it goes on.
Yeah. Okay, let me go with more analogies.
He's like, this is if Hitlers and Goebbels had to hang out off the work site.
Why, one of those is right.
Yeah.
But the thing with Joe,
Yeah.
is I don't know that we have a lot to talk about because of my idea of what he's done to comedy.
Sure.
And I don't think it's great. I think that it's tribalized, and I think that he's created a sort of army of people that think they know comedy, but they only know a specific thing, and what they think is good is not necessarily good. It may be what they're like, what they like, but on the outside of that, most of the sort of sensitive weirdos that we all grew up with in comedy have been sort of pushed aside, and the space for them has become limited, and it's a little.
But there was a time though that alt comedy was the
Not all comedy. I'm not even talking about the alt people.
Okay.
I'm talking about just like interesting stand-ups.
right.
When that happens internally in LA a lot too, where they're like, the store is a fucking, whatever, sellout factory of fucking bro comics. Because
Not anymore.
No, but there was a wash of it that came through, and I think.
Yeah, Joe. They moved to Austin.
But
Yeah, so Mark is doing what he does best here. This is the type of like biting, a little bit self-deprecating, but ultimately just scathing style of comedy that in the course of his podcast definitely has made him notable to broader audiences. But I think before that in his career, he was just known as like the bitter guy who was, a leader in comedy and was one of the top tier comedians in like the scene that he comes from. And he talks about that a little bit here, like when Joe Rogan came into the scene and people that he sort of views as being in that realm. And a lot of WTF was focused on, these little disputes that he had with other comics over the years, like Joe Rogan, and little resentments that they did or did not have or perceive between each other. I mean, that's a lot of what WTF has been about. That's a lot of what made it really interesting in the beginning. And Joe Rogan and Marc Maron did an episode not too long after Joe Rogan's, initial popularity happened. And I recommend going to watch that too, because you get a sense for what Marc is good at, which is getting people to talk a lot by sort of making, subtle digging accusations at them, especially when he has some kind of baggage with them. So that's what's going on here. There's definitely baggage here, but I also think he's noticing a specific turn in the culture where people are kind of taking the format that he helped create and turning it into something much more cynical than it was, which I guess is just kind of the pattern of how all this stuff works. You know what I mean? Like, you make a great contribution, but ultimately, if it's replicable, people who have bad intentions are going to take your formula and use it in a much more cynical and capitalistic way. And that's exactly what's happening. And so I don't always think he articulates that perfectly. I think, like I said, a lot of times it just kind of comes off as bitterness, and anybody who's a fan of the sort of Rogan world of comedy or whatever is going to just view this as bitterness. It doesn't really come off, even though he kind of makes the joke, like, this is reasoned critique. I agree that that's what it is, but, I don't think he's reaching across the aisle here necessarily. I don't think he's trying to, and he does mention that in his special, that it's like, how much am I really trying to like make the joke that's going to change somebody's heart and mind? But at the same time, I think it's important to have people out there who are trying to do that. As cynical as he might be about it, he is one of the greats. So the chances that some asshole might see some bit of his that makes him think differently is non-zero, and it is kind of worth doing. That's the benefit of all of these disgusting content machines that we all are sort of forced to engage with in order to get ourselves out there, is that you can actually reach people in a profound way. You don't always realize who you're reaching and how you're reaching them, but sometimes you can definitely like make a real impact with somebody. So I wish a guy like Marc Maron wouldn't fight against himself so much on that, because I think he is talented enough to do that. But it's interesting to hear this whole critique that he has about marginalized people are down, and trans people are in a worse position than they were before, and immigrants are being targeted. And so at what point do you not have anything to joke about anymore? At what point is it not fun to make fun of these people anymore? And it's interesting for him to lob this criticism on Bad Friends, this podcast that he's on, because a lot of Bobby Lee and Andrew Santino's material comes down to that as well. And I think the podcast is all right. It's reasonably entertaining, but they do fall back on just like racist jokes, racist Asian voices, or voices of Mexicans or whatever, and even teasing a little bit about immigration and that sort of thing. It's like they don't shy away from that, and often they fall back on it or use it as a crutch. And I'm sure that is not lost on Marc Maron either. I mean, to an extent, Bad Friends has kind of marketed themselves that way. Bobby Lee has certainly marketed himself that way. So I think that criticism is aimed at them a little bit. Like, at what point is it not fun to do these silly voices and cheekily kick people who are marginalized anymore, because they are being targeted by society at large, not just comedians. So I think that will, for the most part, fall on deaf ears. Maybe when it comes to Andrew Santino or Bobby Lee, that could make an impact. But I don't necessarily know that that's what Marc Maron's trying to do. I think he's just trying to air it out. I do think a part of him knows that if he just doesn't give a fuck and says this shit out loud, that it's going to attract more attention and people are going to watch his special. I do recommend the special. I think it's good. I wish it was a little bit less self-focused, because even though that might be what makes him great and great at what he does and gives it a particular style, I do think that he could be, really useful in the fight against the people like Rogan and Theo Von out there. to sort of break down some of the influence that they have. Maybe that's his goal in some sense. He's been doing a lot more acting lately, and he's probably straight off that for the rest of his life, or, has other things lined up. Who knows? I don't know what he's planning. He said that he's moving on from WTF because they never really wanted to do video, and they kind of did everything they needed to do. They interviewed everybody, according to him. And I think that's probably mostly true. They were probably tired of finding people to interview. There's always more people to interview. I think it may be a lack of curiosity with the people that are, on the menu, so to speak. But also, I think probably he feels the fact that this show is less relevant than the Joe Rogans and the new podcast bros and stuff like that. And they don't want to update this to a video format, WTF. So it's like, at that point you have to adapt in one direction. So you either adapt the show or you adapt to doing something other than the show. So it seems like that's what he is aiming for. And I do think that adaptation is something to pay attention to when it comes to these podcasters. The guys who have been able to fill up this space and be oddly relevant when it comes to these political interviews and stuff, it's because they were sharp and they kind of adapted to a format that worked, and then they were opportunistic about having certain politicians on, and then that helped them build their profile and all that. And so, that evolution is cynical in a lot of ways, and it's griftery in a lot of ways, but it has allowed them to fill up a lot of space very fast. And so, there's different ways to approach adapting to different formats. Joe Rogan has done that well, you know what I mean? Like with the Spotify deal and then going back to YouTube. He's changed a little bit over the years while keeping the format of the show basically the same. And that, I think, is why he has maintained the relevance that he has. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Marc Maron. I think he's a smart guy. He did a lot of great work in the scene. And, ultimately, I hope he keeps fighting, because there's not that many people out here kind of spreading the message that he's spreading at the moment. Him, Jesselnick, Bill Burr. When it comes to comedians, that's kind of all we got, other than, smaller guys who kind of come from that background, I guess. But, when it comes to these older comedians who do have a lot of voice and have a lot of trust when it comes to audiences, it's not that often that we hear them pushing back against the reactionary sort of tone of the time. So it's good wherever we can get it from.